Okay. So good morning, Preeti. Good morning, Anirudh. Good morning, Kiran. And what we'll do is, before we just move on with the discussion today, we'll just summarize the topics that we had covered in the last class, right? So this is a batch, you know. So in today's discussion, there is a combination of batch, my 9 a.m. batch and the 2 p.m. batch. Uh, Luckily, in the last class, we had been discussing the same topic, right? So in Kiran's batch, I had started discussion on. I'm just in the verge of completing behavior scorecards, and in the process of initiating discussion on BASEL, and I had a discussion with him on engineering side of things. On the other hand, in the 2 p.m. batch with Anirudh and Preeti, I had closed on discussions on the statistical side of things, and I had also started a discussion with the expected losses and stuff like that, right? So therefore, both these batches. So in today's discussion, both these batches have been combined, right? So there have been some concerns in some of the members of the 2 p.m. batch, and hence, since I was discussing the same topic, I decided to have a joint discussion, right? And in both these batches in the last class, I had been discussing about expected losses. Okay. So having said that, so I'll just recapitulate on the. So we'll recapitulate on the discussions that we have had in the last class, right? And from there, what we'll do is we will take it up again. Uh, so, as per the discussions that we have had in the last class, we had been talking about the expected losses, about the concept of expected losses, right? About the expected losses, about the different sources from which a bank earns losses, and the different kind of models that are developed. Why are we developing the models, and so on, right? So we saw that there are three core sources of risk from which a bank makes losses or bank can incur losses. One is the credit risk, second is the market risk, third is the operational risk, right? So these are the three core sources of risks from which the bank makes losses. Now, when the bank is so, if these are the three sources, right? Now, out of these three sources, we will be addressing only one source of the riskiness, right? So, over here, what we have is the credit risk, we have market risk, and we have the operational risk. So, over here, our focus would be mostly on the credit risk side of things, right? And in credit risk, what we saw is that a bank would make profit by making this, the bank would be, just give me a moment. Okay, so basically what happens over here is that what we have seen is the bank generally lends from a low risk segment or borrows from a low risk segment and lends to a high risk segment, right? And the interest differential becomes the profit of the bank. And at each stage, the bank uh, deploys certain credit risk management strategies, right, beginning from the origination to the behavior, in maintaining capital account and in maintaining stress or a buffer capital to help them survive the different downturn periods, right? So, so having seen that, the next thing that we need to understand are the two broad types of losses that a bank can earn. Number one is a expected loss or the portfolio loss, the loss that the bank earns from its business every time. So basically, these are the losses which I expect that would occur, right? So I had lent out to certain borrowers, and from those borrowers, I know that okay, these are the challenges these are risky borrowers, and from them, I can earn losses. So I'm aware of these losses from the from my account management strategies and my account monitoring, portfolio monitoring exercises. Now, these losses, since they are very monitored and strictly strategized, therefore, these losses are very small in percentages. So, in terms of exposure, these loss percentages are actually very less. On the other hand, there is the unexpected losses. The unexpected losses are those losses which occur over and above the expected losses, right? So the unexpected losses are treated to be variations from the unexpected loss and from the expected loss, say within a 95% with a 95% interval, whatever the losses are. So that's the within a mu plus minus 2 sigma kind of a thing. That's an unexpected loss. Now what happens is the potential loss. So losses occurring beyond unexpected losses is your potential loss. So the potential loss, as we discussed in the last class, comprises of a loss behavior where the potential, which is very rare in terms of occurrence. Say these losses generally do not occur; they occur once in 1,000 years. But if they do occur, then they can lead the bank to financial oblivion and oblivion. So the bank might just collapse because of the extent of loss that it might get. So these are huge volumes of shock events. Their exposures are extremely large, but the probability of occurrence is extremely small. Therefore, banks need to keep aside capital which would help them prevent from expected losses, from unexpected losses, from potential losses, right? So this is how the levels of capital are of a bank is decided. So there is one level of capital which absorbs the unexpected loss and potential loss. There is one level of capital which absorbs the expected loss. There is one level of capital which absorbs the stress capital, the macroeconomic stress or downturn scenarios, right? Or the shocks due to downturns and all. So one thing that we can see is that the bank, when we address the problem of credit risk management, it's all about ensuring that the bank has capital, enough capital, so that it can survive different periods of stresses or different cases of stresses. So expected cases of losses, unexpected losses, potential losses, so on, right? So there are a lot of different layers of capital that the bank needs to keep aside. And now, if the bank is willing to, if the bank needs to keep aside this capital, right? They just cannot do it according to their will, because it is always the tendency of a bank to play down on the amount of reserves that are required. They would always try to release more amount of capital, more amount of money to be paid as shareholder dividends from their profits. And to ensure this, that the bank is adequately capitalized, there are different regulations which come into place, right? And as per our discussion in the last class, we have seen that. that the capital, so when we are talking about this capital uh, maintenance, right, or putting up capital and to ensure that there is sufficient amount of capital and all. So over there, we are extensively focusing on the expected losses. So first of all, in order to compute anything else, the first and the most important thing that we need to understand is the expected losses. So what exactly is the expected loss? What exactly is the unexpected loss? And to assess this expected loss, right, we have these models PD, LGD, and EAD. So we saw that how is it that these concepts of PD, LGD, and EAD is related to this concept of expected losses, right? And what we concluded as per our discussion in the last session is that if we want to find out an expected loss first in the process of capital, in order to ensure that the bank has adequate volume of capital, right? What we have done is we saw that we need to start off with the expected credit losses first. So once we estimate the credit expected losses, from there we can estimate the unexpected loss. From there we can estimate the potential loss. And this goes on and we can get all the ideas. So, but first, initial step is to identify what is the volume of the expected loss. And there are three important components over there. One is PD, the second is LGD, third is EAD. Right? So now in today's discussion, now there are two parts to the discussion that comes forward, right? And this is the part which over which we need to, you know, think, and we need to understand each of the concepts that go into it. Now, before I talk about expected loss, right? So obviously there is a very broad section which goes into it, and where we have the technical literature which talks about developing and validating these models. So that's the technical piece, right? Where I talk about development. And validation, right? And it is this part where we'll talk about developing PD, LGD, and EAD models. Talk about developing the PD, LGD, and the EAD models. The EAD models. Right. Now, the second set of literature that we have over here is the following, which is the regulatory piece. That is, what are the regulations which drive the development of these models? So the question that we ask ourselves at this point of time is, we need to ensure that the models that are being developed over here derive their information or derive their structure from the regulations, right? And the regulation that we primarily talk about over here is the Basel Accords. This is where we bring in the concept of Basel. So, what exactly is Basel like? What is the basic objective of uh, you know, the Basel Accord. What does the Basel Accord say about it? And how is it that our model development norms would differ from products to products? Right, so what are the different portfolios? What are the different sub portfolios? How do you identify those portfolios? And above all, the first question that we start off answering over here is why Basel, right? And then what we'll do is from Basel, we'll move into these three components, and from there, we move into address LGD, PD, LGD, and EAD models. So these are the three broad group of models which are to be developed in the over the which are to be developed over the next few sessions. Okay, so let's. The first question that comes out over here is why Basel? Why, or rather, let's put the question like this: that why do you think has Basel become so important over the last few years? Right. So I'll before going into the core model development side, I'll just create that framework, right? So that you can actually justify that why is it that I would need a PD model in my system, in my ecosystem, even when I have a behavior scorecard. Why is it that I would require an EAD model, or why would I need a triple L model if I already have a loss forecasting model in place which drives my business? So what exactly are the rationale for that? Why do we need these separate set of regulatory models? And for what type of product, how are the models developed? That is what we are going to talk about. Okay. So basically, the objective of Basel is to ensure or is to recommend a structure such that banks can be adequately capitalized. So Basel is a set of accords. And when I talk about Basel, you know, Basel is not something very different. It's just the name of the place that is there, right? So over here, when I talk about the Basel Accords, right? So Basel is a place in Switzerland, right, where the Bank of International Settlements had profounded, they had just uh, they had laid down these set of rules and regulations that banks must follow, so that they can be capital adequate. So Basel is a set of recommendations, right? It's not a law. It's a set of recommendations to make a bank capital sufficient, or make a bank adequately capitalized, right? And Basel was formulated by a group of professionals from Switzerland, so that is known as the BCBS, that is Basel Committee for Banking Supervision. So committee was set up, right, and they laid the first set of the recommendations, if I'm not mistaken, in the year 1980, right, and since then, the Basel one came into being, and over time, Basel has evolved. So once we started off with Basel one in 1980, followed by Basel two in 2005, followed by a Basel three in 2013, and Basel four being on the way, right? So first came Basel one was 1980. I don't really remember whether it's 1980 or 1990, something around that. So Basel 2 is that framework. It was one of the most important framework which the Basel Committee had suggested, because it led to the foundation of the AIRB approach, right? So if Basel 2 was not there, then all these job requirements on PDH and PAD would not be coming into your inboxes, right? And I would not be running off over here on my CRM module. So Basel 2 is one of the most it's one of the path-breaking resolutions that could have had, and from there you have the Basel 3, which came up mostly in 2013, I guess. Like Basel 3 came up in 2013, and it had laid out more. It had concretized the gaps which was prevalent in the previous in the previous approaches, and Basel 4 on the way. Right. So these are the different versions of Basel, and with each version, the accords started getting more and more stringent. Right. Now, what was the basic philosophy of Basel? Basel had a very simple philosophy. It said that. So initially, what Basel said that there was so whenever a bank is into a business and it's lending out, right, so it must set aside 8% of its total uh, you know total asset as capital. So you just need to. Okay, am I audible now? Hello. Okay, great. So coming to this next part, right? So talking about Basel. So Basel initially said that you just need to keep aside 8% of your total reserves as your capital, right? However, going forward, as the banking system started becoming more and more complex, right, the assets also started becoming more and more complex. Now, the riskiness associated with the assets were very different. Okay, 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 great. Uh, I'm audible now, right? Great. So actually, there is some issue with go to meetings today. I don't know what is the problem. Okay, great. So as we start off, right? So talking about Basel. So Basel, as a regulation, as an accord, right, had three major pillars. The first pillar that Basel, as an accord, emphasized on was in ensuring minimum capital requirements. So the first thing the accord said is that as a bank, you need to keep aside a minimum amount of capital which will help you sustain sudden or expected losses. So if you be it sudden losses or your unexpected losses, sudden or adverse shocks, or be it expected losses. So whenever you are lending out, you need to ensure that you have sufficient amount of capital at the back, which will actually help you prevent yourself from collapsing in case of a shock, right? So the first pillar that Basel talks about is the minimum capital requirement. So minimum capital requirement, which will help you prevent, help you survive losses from credit, open market, and operational sources. Clear? So that's the first piece. The second is supervisory reporting. So this is the second pillar. Supervisory reporting. Right? And obviously, basically, when I'm talking about supervisory reporting, I'm talking about like ensuring that all the pillar two risks and all whether all the reports or whether to ensure that all the banking parameters are in line, are in compliance with what the bank has, right? And the third pillar is market discipline to ensure that the market actually operates in a very disciplined manner. So generally, market discipline is something which we generally do not really work with, right? We mainly work with minimum capital requirements and supervisory reporting in our day-to-day work, right? Even I do not have very clear idea as to what is there in market discipline because I have never been a part of this particular process. So, however, these are the three broad pillars or the three broad uh, ideologies on which Basel is based. And now over here, this is the most lucrative part of all the three models. That is the minimum capital requirement. And over here, Basel talks about keeping aside sufficient amount of capital so that the bank can tide over credit risk, market risk, and operational risk. And operational risk. So these are the three core sources of risk from which a bank will ideally suffer. Or these are the core sources of risk from which the bank may face both challenges. Okay. Now over here within our model or within our module we'll be talking mostly about within the first pillar we'll be talking mostly about the minimum capital requirement. And within this Within capital requirement, we'll be talking only about credit risk and the different sources of credit risk, which is the borrower's risk, which reflects the borrower's risk. And when I talk about borrower's risk, right, so there comes, so we are mostly concerned with behavior risk because when I'm trying to, so my, if I'm trying to keep aside substantial amount of capital, right, then I need to assess the overall riskiness of the borrowers to whom I have given the loan. So over here, when I'm talking about credit risk or borrower's risk, what I'm talking essentially about is the borrower's behavior risk. Right, so this is precisely what three things are: credit risk, borrower's risk, and from there, behavior risk. So having said this, we need to know that what are the different sources of this behavior risk. Now, behavior risk arises from a deterioration in the borrower's willingness to pay back. From a deterioration in the willingness to pay back. So if a borrower has been paying historically, right, but now what happens is he actually starts going back and he's unable to pay back the money and he is becoming a defaulter at the end of the month, right? And he's unable to pay back his dues and so on. So that is where what we get to see is this guy has a sudden deterioration in the structure. I mean, he has some amount of he has a sudden deterioration in the overall behavior of the borrower. So deterioration in the willingness to pay back. In the willingness to pay. So over here, if a bank is trying to, find out the minimum amount of capital, right? Then and he's trying to assess the risk, the borrower's risk, then he needs to assess two important components. Number one, he should not only assess the decrease or the fall in the willingness to pay, but also he must ensure that what should I say? He must also assess for the loss that he can incur. The loss that the bank can incur is a part of his of this behavior. So, basing on what the behavior of the borrower is, or basing on whether the borrower is such that his willingness to payment has deteriorated, he has undergone a credit deterioration, then the objective of the bank is also to understand his also to understand the losses that they they can possibly make as a part of that deterioration in the behavior. And this is where the role of LGD and EAD models come in, right? So when I'm talking about the deterioration in the willingness to pay, willingness to repay, right? So this is where you are talking about your PD model. This is where probability of default model will come in. PD model comes in. Model comes in. On the other hand, on the other hand, uh, when I'm assessing behavior risk, I'm also assessing the loss that can arise due to the deterioration. The loss that can arise. The loss that can arise as a result of the deterioration. And this is where the role of EAD and LGD models and LGD models. Right, so this is where the concept of EAD and LGD models. Clear on this part? Great. Now, the part that comes up is that I've been talking about capital requirements, right? And at the same time, I'm talking about this PDLGD EAD model. Also, at the same time, there is another open block that I have where I've talked about expected losses and unexpected losses. So the next thing that we need to do is we need to pull these three concepts together. I need to create the bridge between EL or ELUL, capital, and PDLGD EAD. So we need to know not only how these models are developed, but also what we need to know is that where do these models actually fall in, right? So that is the next part that we will talk about, right? So over here, let's try to build the bridge between these three concepts. So what are the three concepts that we are trying to talk about? What are the three blocks between which we are trying to build the bridge? The three blocks are: one is capital requirement. The second that we have over here is your PDLGD, and the third that I have over here is ELGA. So over here, capital PD, LGD, and over here what I have is EL. So now obviously one thing is very clear, that capital is used, or the entire amount of capital that we have will be distributed between EL and UL, and the PD LGD EAD will go into EL. and divergence from EL will be your UL or your unexpected loss. So now how does this happen? So how does the capital get allocated between EL and UL? So to understand this, we need to understand the different tiers of capital that a bank has. The first and the most important tier of capital that the bank has is your tier 1 capital. One capital. Second is tier 2 capital. Third is tier 3 capital. Right. However, when we are talking about regulatory capital, right, whenever we talk about regulatory capital, there are these two tiers that are there. So these two tiers together capture, or they together comprise the regulatory. Now, if I'm talking about regulatory capital as such, right? Now, talking about regulatory capital as such, so what exactly are the components of regulatory capital? What does tier one? What is the objective of tier one? What is the objective of the tier two capital? What does these capital compose of, or what are these capitals actually like? What are they composed of? So basically, the tier one capital is considered to be the purest form of capital, and this tier one capital is used to capture all forms of unexpected losses. Tier two capital is the secondary, or is a it's a supplementary form of capital, which is used to capture which is which comprises of, or which absorbs the shocks from expected losses, or which absorbs all the expected losses. So the question that comes out is, what exactly are these? Now, talking about the most important type of capital, which is the tier 1 capital. The tier 1 capital for a bank is considered to be the purest form of capital. This is the purest form of capital. The purest form of capital. This is the purest form of capital. Now, if I say this is the purest form of capital, what do I mean? This capital comprises of the equity capital, the capital which the bank has pulled up, or It is the capital which the bank has drawn through, you know, has drawn through your shareholders and by the issue of shares, and also that is why it's called the purest form of capital, and it is the actual capital that the bank has with them in the bank, right? So this is known as the tier 1 capital. It is the purest form of capital, or as we call it, it's the equity capital. So that means this is the capital which the bank has raised through its IPOs, through its initial public offerings. Right. So what you know over here is that there is this pure. So this capital is your purest capital, and this is the actual capital that you have within the bank. Now, the tier two capital, as we call it, is a non-equity capital. So it comprises of the sources of all estimated form of capital, like provisions, like it contains ALLL, it contains other hybrid debts and so on. But this is more of an estimated capital that the bank, this is the amount of capital that the bank keeps aside in expectation of certain challenges which might come up. Right? So that is the reason why it is used to may take up expected losses. Right? Okay. So Anirudh has a question over here. He's asking me, can you give us an idea about tier one capital? Great. So before I move on to tier two capital, we'll discuss tier one capital slightly more, and then we'll go into tier two capital. Right. So over here, before you know, so what does what do I mean by equity capital? Now, banks. Okay. So banks generally issue their shares, or they issue equity, right? So just give me a moment, guys. Okay. So banks issue shares, right? They issue equity shares, they issue preference shares, and all kind of different shares. So this equity capital is nothing but the share capital. So what is a share? A share gives a fraction of an ownership to the person who buys the share. So it's a kind of a divisible ownership which owners of shares have towards a company. Right? So if someone buys some amount of shares, then they can get directorial rights of a certain organization, and that is the way they can actually become owners of that company, owners of a joint stock company. So similarly, banks also issue their shares. Now, when banks issue their shares, they get the capital, right? So, if I issue shares worth 100 rupees, right, I sell out a paper worth 100 rupees, and then what happens is you know, I issue a share paper, and corresponding to that, what I get is the share or the capital money. So if I issue papers worth 1 lakh rupees, I'm drawing up 1 lakh rupees from the bank. Sorry, I'm not drawing up 1 lakh worth of capital from the market. So that is the exact amount of physical capital that is there in my bank. Right. So this is why equity capital or share capital is considered to be the purest form of capital that a bank might have. right? Great. Now comes the tier 2 capital. The tier 2 capital is a type of an estimated capital that a bank has. So, what do I mean by an estimated capital? Say, for example, I am developing my PD, LGD, and EAD models, right? And I'm computing my expected loss. So, I'm saying that this expected loss is an estimate of the amount of provisions that I would have or that I can have, or the provision. This is a provision against the doubtful loans that I might have in the next 12 months. But you observe that whatever I'm doing a predictive exercise, right? So this is not the actual loss that I am making. This is a predicted loss that I am making. I am predicting this amount of loss. But think about it in other ways. It might so happen that say I say that okay, my the doubtful debt that I have is worth 1 million, but in reality I might make losses worth 1.25 million, but I keep aside 1 million. Therefore, since this is a predicted form of a capital, or since I'm predicting this the occurrence of this capital, therefore this is not an actual capital. Now as a finance team or as a finance head, what I might do is I might play around with my accounting rules or with my data, and I might just reduce the amount of capital. In that case I would be under provisioning against my capital. Therefore, say suppose I treat this tier 2 capital with the utmost importance, then what can happen? That it is that I have done subjective assessments and I have purposefully reduced the level of money that is to be kept aside as provisions. Because if I keep aside money for provisions, I am actually foregoing a loanable fund. So I'm actually foregoing an opportunity. That is the reason why what I'll do is I will instead of putting this as a instead of putting the money in the provision, I'll actually put it against the so I'll undercode my provisions, and in that way I'll ensure that I have sufficient amount of capital left, sufficient amount of money left for you know for lending out to my as loanable funds or giving out as profits to my shareholders, etc. So this is a very subjective or a management driven kind of a stuff. Therefore, if this is treated with utmost importance, then I might see that during a downturn or during a sudden period of sudden loss, my bank is under provision. Therefore, tier 2 capital gets a secondary importance because tier 2 is a capital which has been set aside basis the predictive judgment of the banking management. Now, if there is subjective management involved into something, then I cannot treat it as an actual or as a very important source of capital. This is not the most purest form of capital because I might keep as provision $1 million against my doubtful debts, but I might see that my actual doubtful debts are 1.3. So even though the management knew it could be around 1.3, that purposely under provision so that it could release that zero point 0.3 million as dividends or loanable funds going forward. So they could have used it for expansion strategies. So when it is based on someone's expansion, I cannot be conservative enough. I cannot be conservative enough to you know to use that as a capital structure. But obviously, yes, that is the capital that I am setting aside against all expected losses, all types of losses which I expect may arise, but has still not happened. Right. So this is the amount of capital I'm setting aside for expected loss, but not for incurred losses. These are not actual or incurred losses. These are expected losses. So therefore, tier 2 capital comprises of all kinds of uh, expected or losses which are conjectured by the management that can happen, and based on that some amount is set aside. But tier 2 capital comes with a restriction. It says that the tier 2 capital cannot be greater than the tier 1 capital. So I cannot actually use tier 2 capital to absorb all my major losses. So all the major losses has to be absorbed by the tier 1 capital. Therefore, tier 1 capital must be such maintained such that all unexpected and potential losses can be captured, right? So that is tier 1 losses, or tier 1 capital should always be greater than the tier 2 capital. Right. So tier 1 capital comprises of equity capital. Tier 2 capital comprises of all kinds of expected capital earnings. Right. Therefore, tier 1 capital is the most purest form of capital. Tier 2 capital is a kind of projected or conjectured capital, and hence is of relatively lower importance compared to tier 1 capital. Clear on this part? Any questions up to this point? So over here, one thing is important, right? So just keep one thing in mind, that this is a kind of a question which comes out in credit risk interviews, that what exactly are the components of tier 1 capital, what is tier 2 capital, and why is it that tier 2 capital cannot exceed tier 1 capital, right? Because of conservative estimates, so if I am a conservative banking planner, then I would ensure that I have sufficient amount of actual capital rather than conjectured capital, because conjecturing comes with an error, right? So there can be conjecturing errors which might clear. Great. Now coming to the next one. So over here, what we want to ideally do is the following. We want to so therefore one thing we can clearly see is that the PDLGD EAD is a part, or when we are developing these models, we are calculating expected losses, we are actually computing a part of the part of the tier 2 capital, and all the and the capital which is used to maintain unexpected losses or potential losses would be falling under tier 1 capital, right? And obviously, as we can also see that this PDLGD EAD, this sources from the portfolio risk, from the behavior of the borrowers, right? Now, talking about this entire framework, right? So now there is a huge, the extent, the overall extent of the coverage of this entire regulation is very large. There is a huge extent to which this, this covers the discussions, to cover discussions on BASEL. BASEL is a huge area. Over here, we will be focusing mostly on developing the PDLGD EAD models. The objective of the discussion till now has been to give you an idea as to where and how So where this thing actually features. Where does PDLGD feature in? Right? The next stage is to assess the importance of these models, to understand what are the respective business decisions, to understand what are the exactly the statistical problems that each of these models would address. Right? So talking about the PD, LGD, and the EAD models. So the first question we ask over here is that what is a PD model? What is a probability of default model? What is the business problem for a PD model? So basically, think about it in this way: that there are borrowers to whom we have given the loans, and they turn out to be risky. I mean, not all of them, but some of them turns out to be risky. Now, based on their behavior or based on the changes in their behavior, it is very important that the bank identifies that who are the more risky borrowers and who are likely to default in the next 12 months. Because, say, at the end of April, right? So, so at the end of March, right, when the banks declare the statement, the banks get their profits, right? Now, some amount of money needs to be set aside from this profit to ensure that the bank is adequately capitalized, and the rest go out as uh, you know shareholder dividends or other profits, investments, etc., retained earnings, whatever, as well as loanable funds and so on. So basically, when so standing today in on the 1st of April, I need to understand that from the 1st of April 2018 till the 31st of March 2019, which are the borrowers who are likely to default? And from this default, how much am I at stake? What portion of my total exposure is at stake? And from that exposure, what is that percentage which goes on to loss? Right? So, and this prediction needs to be done over the next 12 months. Clear? And that is where we come up with questions related to PD, LGD, and EAD models. Okay. Okay. Now, so over here, So let's first of all have a quick look into the the business problem of a probability of default model of PV model. So the biggest challenge, or the most interesting characteristics of a PV model is that it is dichotomous in nature. So it's y equals to 1 if the borrower defaults in the next year. Borrower defaults in next 12 months. So if the borrower defaults in the next 12 months, equal to 0 otherwise. So over here, if you have a look into this, then if I'm trying to frame an understanding, or if I'm trying to predict this, what is the dependent variable that I have? So the dependent variable over here is very categorical in nature. Right? And all I want to know over here is that what is the probability that a particular borrower will default. So my objective over here is to predict probability of y equals to 1. Right? Now, the next part. So once I have estimated the probability of the borrower to default, from there I can actually find out, by looking into the probability distribution of the borrowers, I frame an idea about who is a more risky borrower and who is a relatively less risky borrower. And that is where the next part or the next stage of calculation comes in, where we try to understand what exactly is the exposure at default for this borrower. So if this borrower defaults in the next 12 months, what exactly will be the exposure when this borrower defaults? So what is the exposure at default for this borrower? Right? So this is the next question that we try to answer, and from there we come to the next model over here, which is the EA model. Okay, so over here Anirudh has a question. Why not in every month as borrowers can default more than once? No, when you are looking into probability of default, right, you need to monitor the behavior of the borrower over a certain period of month. Now, in a given month, a borrower can go delinquent, but he may not necessarily be a defaulter. So there is a difference between the concept of a defaulter and a delinquent borrower. Now, if I remain delinquent for a continuous period of time, then I can tell that yes, man, I am a defaulter, right? So we'll come to that. But when you look into the behavior of a borrower, right, you're trying to predict the probability of a borrower to default. We generally do not. You cannot do it on a given month. It has to be done over the next 12 months. And the reason is that BASEL, as a regulatory body, the regulator says that you need to assess the next 12 months default, because next month the default cannot be identified, right? There is something called a performance period. You need to assess the performance of the borrower over a period of next 12 months and check in that period of next 12 months, does this borrower satisfy the definition of a bad borrower, or does he satisfy the probability, I mean, does he satisfy the definition of a defaulter, right? So this is the reason why we do it over the next 12 months, not in a given month. Clear? Great. So the next question that comes out over here is the EAD, or the exposure at default. Now, when I talk about EAD, so what is exposure at default? So, what it means is that in the next 12 months, if given that a borrower defaults, right, what is estimated exposure, right? Okay. So now, when I talk about this exposure, about this EAD model over here, right? Now there are, so basically the objective over here is to understand what are the factors which will explain the exposure of a borrower. Now the exposure at default of the borrower. So this is an estimated exposure value. So if the borrower is defaulting in the next 12 months, what is the estimated exposure? So over here we talk about exposure. Exposure, and it's a function of different models. So some different variables, x1, x2, x2 like this. So there will be independent variables in terms of which this can be estimated. So observe that the dependent variable over here is exposure, and this exposure is a variable which belongs from, which can be defined between minus infinity to plus infinity. However, if an exposure is a negative exposure, it means that there has been an overpayment, right? And hence it means that no exposure is left. So it is capped at zero. Therefore, this 0 to infinity often does not exist. It is taken to be a continuous value defined between 0 to plus infinity, because my negative infinity is always negative infinity to 0 is capped at 0. Because if I have a negative exposure, it means I have actually overplayed, right? And then what it means is that I deserve a refund from the bank, something like that. But there is no real time exposure over there along with me. Okay. So over here, what we have is exposure and default. So therefore, what you can see is that the dependent variable over here is a continuous variable, right? Now, exposure and default models have different varieties, right? Now, these models can differ based on whether the product for which it is being developed is a revolving product or whether is it a closed-end product. Is it a revolving product or whether is it a closed-end product, or whether it is a term loan product. So what type of a product it is, based on that, this measure will be discussed. So whether is it a closed-end product. Right. Now coming to the next part. So talking about exposure, right? Now, the methods that can be used to deliver this model or develop these models is segmentation driven methods. It's a segmentation driven method. Then there is a linear regression driven method. Linear regression driven method, and so on, right? And for PD model, the different statistical the modeling techniques would incorporate logistic regression model, big regression model. Then what we have is survival analysis models. So we have survival analysis models, then we have neural network models, then we have segmentation models, and so on. So there is a whole set of different modeling techniques which are there, which are available over there, right? So also we have neural network techniques. Neural net techniques, and then we also have alternate segmentation techniques. Right? So these are two broad models, right? Now from this, the third set of models that we talk about is the LGD model or the loss given default model. Now what happens is that once you have developed your EAD model, right? The next set of models that we develop is the loss given default model. The next part is the LGD model. So what is LGD? Or what is loss given default? Now, if I talk about loss given default models, uh, talking about loss given default models. Now, see, there are some accounts which have defaulted, right? Now, from those defaulted models, what we get is the what has been the total exposure which has arrived at default, right? And then what you look into is what is the amount that can be recovered from those exposures. So from this loss given default models, so from there, so from the exposure and default, we compute the loss given default. So loss given default arises for those set of accounts which have defaulted, right? And there is 1 minus the recovery rate. So whatever has not been recovered, that is your LGD. So whatever has not been recovered is the LGD model. Right? So over here, now what is the dependent variable over here? So over here, whatever has not been recovered, right, that is your LGD. So your LGD is also, if I think about it in this perspective, right, then your LGD belongs to the value, the interval like 0 and 1, right? Now if it is over there between 0 and 1, then one way that we can do this is we can use a beta regression to develop this particular model. So there is this beta regression model, right? The next that we have over here is the linear regression. Now suppose I want to predict the recovery rate. So what exactly is the total amount that has been recovered out of the total exposure? So what I can do is I can actually estimate the recovery value and then calculate that recovery as a part of the exposure that was there, right? So then 1 minus recovery rate would be the loss given default. So therefore another method through which I can actually do is linear regression. Is linear regression. The third thing that I do over here is the third thing that I have over here is logistic regression as well. So suppose I want to understand whether a particular account is recovered or not. Right, so that's the probability of the recovery. So the total number of accounts from where recovery is possible divided by the total number of total number of accounts. So that gives me the recovery rate. So I can also treat it as a logistic regression approach or the logic approach. Right. So this is what the three measures are. So these are the different modeling techniques that we need to understand if we are to develop the BASEL models. Right. So there are multiple modeling frameworks that are there. Right. Now there are two things. Now modeling, just when we are developing regulatory models, I just cannot happily go ahead and you know develop one single model for or use a model for a particular product. There is always a rule to do that. Depending on the different kind of the business products, there would be different kind of modeling techniques involved. The question that comes out over here is, how do I do this? So the question that comes out over here is that how do I do this? So therefore, before discussing about this side, before discussing about the models, we need to discuss the regulatory framework first. So what are the different products? Because say for example, if I have a retail product, right, the model development procedure would be different. Now suppose if I have a commercial product, the model development procedure would again be different. Now LGD model for a commercial portfolio and the LGD model for a retail portfolio is developed in a very different manner. The LGD model for say the LGD model for a revolving product and the LGD model for a closed-end product is again used in a different manner. It's again developed in a different manner. Okay, so whether the LGD for for a retail product and the LGD for a commercial product would be different. The EAD for a revolving product, the EAD for a closed-end product would be very different. So that is the reason why before we you know go into the model development exercise, we need to frame an understanding of the way the portfolios are structured, right? Or the way BASEL defines a banking portfolio to be. And from there, the next part would be to understand the different kinds of assets and how they are valued, right? And while we talk about these three model components and we talk about the expected credit losses, we would also bring in the second part of the story over here. We would also compare this with the IFRS 9 expected credit losses, right? And with that, we'll get a clear idea about how this expected loss and how the one that has been defined in the in the so uh, so basically whenever there are these different when we bring in together the expected loss and expected credit loss that these two regulations talk about, we will be able to clearly frame an idea about how the regulations differ, what are the different views about uh, this particular metric, right? So how different is a PD model from of IFRS 9 from a PD model in a BASEL model? Or in Basel, right? So how different is a PD model from a commercial portfolio from the PD model of a Basel model, right? So these are the different questions that we will try to actually explore, right? So is the next part or is the next path clear? Great. Great. So the next part that we'll try to talk about over here is the Basel framework, right? So when I talk about the Basel framework, uh, so how does Basel define the portfolios associated with the bank? How would Basel define the banking portfolios? So over here, so Basel talks about two broad type of portfolios. One is retail portfolio, the other is the commercial portfolio, right? So there are these two types of four types of portfolios. One is a retail portfolio, and the other is a commercial portfolio. These are the two broad portfolios to which any bank would lend, right? So it is also known as the retail portfolio, the wholesale portfolio, also known as the retail or the commercial portfolio. So, however it is, like, right. So over here, most important thing that we need to understand is that how is the portfolios defined under Basel? How is the portfolio or how are the portfolios defined under Basel Basel? So over here, the first question that comes out is that how to define the retail portfolio. So a retail portfolio is defined as a Basel defines it where the accounts are not managed independent separately, right? But the accounts are managed in a group. So you have a group of observations on which you are actually managing, based on which you are managing your accounts, right? So there are large number of accounts, of accounts, and each of the accounts have very small exposure. Small exposure, right? So they are collectively managed. They are collectively, right? So when I talk about small amount of exposure, how small? So that is by small, what I would mean is less than 1 million euro. 1 million euro or less. So that is the retail portfolios. In a retail portfolio, it says that there are a large number of accounts, right? And there is each of the accounts have a very small, has a very small probable. I mean, each of the accounts have very small exposures, right? So that is what a retail portfolio is all about. On the other hand, with the commercial portfolios, it is just exactly the opposite. What is it all about in commercial portfolios? We get to see that there are a small number of accounts. There are very less number of defaults, but the exposure of each of the accounts is very large, right? And if one of the accounts fail, in terms of number of defaults, it's very low, but in terms of exposure, it is actually pretty high. Therefore, right, the modeling techniques for commercial portfolios are very different from that used in the retail portfolios. Segmentation models can be used very efficiently in retail models, in retail portfolios, but in commercial portfolios you cannot use them. The reason being that in commercial portfolios you manage the loans individually and not on a segment basis, right? So that is how the differentiation actually works, right? And based on the portfolios, we need to select our choice of the models. Just give me a minute's break, guys. I'll just be back. And in the meantime, if you have any questions, just put it in the chat box. I'll comment it. Okay, so so coming to the next part, coming to the commercial side of things, right? Coming to the commercial part. Okay. So in a commercial portfolio, there are really a small number of borrowers. Number of obligors. Or rather, I should say, there are relatively small number of obligors. Say, for example, in a retail portfolio, there might be some around millions of accounts, whereas in this part there might be kind of around 3,000, 4,000 accounts in the books of the bank, or say say there are like 60,000 accounts in the books of the bank. So there are small number of the relatively small number of obligors. When I say small number of obligors, what I mean is number of obligors are relatively small compared to that we have in the retail segment. However, the exposure of individual accounts is very large. The exposure of accounts is large, right? So therefore, what happens generally is that in most of these cases, the commercial accounts they are mostly individually managed. Now, this is how we define the retail and the commercial portfolios, right? So between 1 to 10 million, I think that's classified as the small and medium scale enterprises, SMEs, and more than 10 million, it's considered as corporates, right? I mean, basis the exposures. So, based on this, so whenever you have, so just imagine it from the perspective that you are fetching a raw data from from your client's raw data set, a raw data warehouse. So you need to know the exact classification that BASEL has to extract the correct observations and extract the correct variables, and extract the correct number of accounts and extract the correct portfolios. Right? So this is where your retail and commercial portfolios are classified. Now the next part that we talk about over here is classifying the sub portfolios. Right now within commercial portfolios, the two sub portfolios that commercial accounts will have or the commercial portfolios will have is SME and corporates. it will have SME and corporates. Right. So what we have over here is SMEs and corporates. Now after that, the next part that we you know the kind of thing that we need to do is that for retail portfolios, there are further sub-classifications, right? There are three sub-classifications to retail portfolios. One is QRRE, the next is mortgages, and the third over here is okay. So basically, these are the three sub portfolios that are there, right? And for each of these sub portfolios, there is a corresponding definition which is there. So in the next class, what we'll do is we'll start off with each of these definitions, right? And for each of these definitions, we'll check how is it that a particular PD, LGD, and a EAD model can be constructed. So if I'm actually constructing a PDLGD model for a QRRE portfolio, what are the type of variables that would be there? If I'm doing it for a mortgage portfolio, what are the type of variables would be there? If I'm doing it for the other retail portfolios, what are the variables that would be there? Right? Then we'll go for the SME and the corporates. Right? So this is the part that we start off with in tomorrow's discussion. Clear? So we meet tomorrow again at 9 a.m. and we'll take up the discussion from there. From there, right? Thank you.